The report indeed underscored that urgent action is required to deal with increasing climate risks and resulting social stressors. The question now is, how do we move forward? To discuss the climate resilient development highlighted in the report, we have Dr. Rosa T. Perez, lead author of Chapter 18 on Climate Resilient Development Pathways. Dr. Rosa Perez is also a senior research fellow of the Manila Observatory. Please welcome Dr. Rosa.
Good morning. My presentation today is about the key messages on climate resilient development, or CRD, of the newly released Working Group to Contributions to IPCC AR6 and its implications on national development. The main message of this report is that climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet, and any further delay in concerted global action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future. Comparing with previous assessment reports, specifically the AR5, this report demonstrates that worldwide climate resilient development action is more urgent than previously assessed. It is already challenging at global warming levels of less than 1.5 degrees Celsius, and the scope and options will become more limited by 2 degrees Celsius. This might not be possible in some regions and sub-regions, including small islands, mountains, and polar regions, if warming exceeds 2 degrees Celsius. Although adaptation action is taking place in all regions of the world, these attempts in adapting to climate change impacts have fallen short. Adaptation limits have already been reached in some places across the globe, and more will emerge as temperature rise, especially if 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming is exceeded. The report has a strong focus on the interactions among the coupled systems of climate, ecosystem, including their biodiversity and human society. These interactions are the basis of emerging risks from climate change, ecosystem degradation, and biodiversity loss. Despite a narrowing window for action, the report tells us that a climate-resilient society is still possible through transformational adaptation together with rapid mitigation led by the country's plans, such as the nationally determined contributions and the national climate change action plans, with benefits for all. Society and ecosystems has to transition to a more resilient state, with climate risk adequately assessed to strengthen adaptation and mitigation actions and transitions that reduce risk and vulnerabilities. Societal choices towards higher CRD or lower CRD resulting from interacting decision and actions by diverse government, private sector, and civil society actors in the context of climate risk, adaptation limits, and development gaps. So in this slide, you can see the green cog showing the dimension that enable actions toward higher climate resilient development, such as ecosystem stewardship, knowledge diversity, equity and justice, and inclusion. On the other hand, the red cog show us the dimensions that results in actions toward lower climate resilient development, like ecosystem degradation, singular knowledge, exclusion, and equity and injustice. The choices we make in the next decades will determine our future, whether our actions will lead us to high or low CRD pathways. So these are the attributes of the high CRD, and these are the attributes of a low CRD, and they are just the opposites. The report defines CRD as resilient development is the process of implementing greenhouse gas mitigation and adaptation measures to support sustainable development. While climate resilient development pathways are development trajectories that successfully integrate greenhouse gas mitigation and adaptation efforts to support sustainable development for all. In this view graph, we can see that we have already missed an opportunity for a higher climate resilient development because of our past choices, whether it's past emissions, climate change, and development choices. And it also shows us that even if we continue on a pathway with warming stabilizing at 1.5 degrees Celsius, we will still encounter some climatic or non-climatic shocks that will derail our pathways to climate resilient development. And those shocks must be addressed. It also shows us here that the color red and orange lines will lead to low CRDs. These are the pathways that have higher warming more than 2 degrees. And we can see that the shocks are even more prominent. Now we look at the implication on the national development. The report says that climate change is a threat to human well-being and health of the planet. We know that the Philippines is a nation at risk from multiple climate and natural hazards. Actions on climate adaptation are urgently needed, as urgently as action on climate mitigation. Action on climate change is inextricably linked to action on other challenges. It is important to note that pursuing climate resilience development pathways will also create opportunities. Rapid urban growth, for instance, presents a time-limited opportunity to achieve climate resilience and sustainable development through some green growth policies and land use planning. But the benefits would be felt more in rural areas as well through stronger supply chains and financial flows. A comprehensive, effective, and innovative response can harness synergies and reduce trade-offs between adaptation and mitigation to advance sustainable development. Disaster risk reduction programs, plans, and activities need to be integrated with climate actions, especially in addressing both the slow onset and rapid onset climate events. Adaptation policies have to be put in place to integrate systemic risk, that is cascading, compounding, and cross-sectoral in terms of jurisdictions and population, from climate hazards as well as related responses, both within and across administrative boundaries. We also would like to explore nature-based solution. Nature offers significant untapped potential, not only to reduce climate risk and deal with the causes of climate change, but also to improve people's lives and livelihoods. A healthy planet is fundamental to climate resilient development. Biodiversity and ecosystem services have limited capacity to adapt to increasing global warming levels, which will make climate resilient development progressively harder to achieve beyond 1.5 degrees warming. Conservation measures to protect and restore natural forests, planting a range of native species, managing pests and diseases, and reduce wildfire risk can build climate resilience. Cooperation with indigenous people and local communities is key, tapping into their indigenous and local knowledge. Transformation entails systems transitions, strengthening the resilience of ecosystem and society, and should be founded on equity and justice. Here, climate justice acknowledges that climate change can have differential adverse impacts, social, economic, public health, and others, on underprivileged population and vulnerable groups, such as people on low incomes, seniors, women and girls, children, ethnic and other minorities. These inequities and vulnerabilities have to be addressed head-on through long-term mitigation and adaptation strategies that are not maladaptive. The decision-making process needs to avoid maladaptation, as these are counterproductive. For example, seawalls might protect communities against rising tides or sea level rise, but if their construction comes at the expense of mangroves or reefs, which are natural buffers to storm surges, not to mention critical wildlife and fishery habitats, such measures are counterproductive. Cultivating large-scale solar or wind farms for renewables at the expense of food security is another example. Just transition in climate change context refers to a framework developed and supported by policies to encompass a range of social interventions needed to secure workers' rights and livelihoods when shifting to sustainable production and activities through a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy. This is true not only for energy sector, but also in other important economic sectors such as agriculture, tourism, and waste management, among others. Just transition involves inclusive decision-making process, understanding of the local context, who are the most influential or who makes the decision, and who would be affected. With identified champions, the just transition process could increase the potential for success. Complementary policies need to be adapted to support the framework. Climate action must also be at the heart of the country's COVID recovery plan. The temporary decline in carbon emission brought about by COVID-19 offers us a chance to redesign many systems toward carbon neutrality, but has also demonstrated the imperative for justice and inclusivity in climate policy. While the urgency of climate change poses many challenges, it also creates the opportunity to emerge from pandemic and economic volatility with healthier, more resilient, and climate-safe societies and environment. A green and blue recovery and just transition are embodiment of the principles of the triple bottom concept of sustainability. Some models that are already available, the Philippines can follow, give us a green growth opportunities. And this one will allow us to have to follow a green recovery to reduce the risk of future pandemics, mitigate and adapt to the impact of climate change, create jobs, increase competitiveness, and meet the sustainable development goals. Pursuing green opportunities, for example, in productive and regenerative agriculture, healthy and productive oceans, sustainable urban development and transport models, circular economy models, and clean energy transition. All of this can contribute to just transition and responses and addressing climate change risks. Investing in blue-green recovery will require also mainstreaming environmental resilience in policymaking, undertaking policy intervention, and identifying sources of sustainable finance. They can also build mechanisms that can produce a lasting shift towards human and natural system resilience through capacity building, institutionalization, and knowledge generation. Investments that facilitate climate resilient development need to be rapidly scaled up and advances more quickly with increased international cooperation and financial assistance. Taking actions now can secure our future. Enabling conditions for such actions include strong political leadership, institutions, resources including finance, knowledge and capacity building, as well as climate services, information and decision support tools. Public finance is an important enabler of adaptation. Public mechanisms and finance can leverage private sector finance for adaptation by addressing real and perceived regulatory cost and market barriers, for example, via public-private partnership. Financial and technological resources enable effective and ongoing implementation of adaptation, especially when supported by institutions with a strong understanding of adaptation needs and capacity. And again, knowledge needs to be diverse. It is not only about scientific and technical knowledge, but also including indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, and citizens' science to understand the operational pathways and institutional structures for governance that effectively support climate action that is inclusive of diverse priorities and voices in planning and decision making. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.